12 minutes. That's all it took to end the marriage of Patricia Kennedy Lawford. 12 minutes, behind a closed courtroom door, in a ski town in Idaho, 3,000 miles from the church where it started. No press inside, no family in the room, just a judge, a file, and a woman who had spent 17 years being photographed as the perfect wife. Patricia Kennedy Lawford, sister of a dead president, sister of 2 sitting senators, married to Hollywood royalty in front of 3,000 spectators, and in January 1966, she became the first person in the entire Kennedy family history to get divorced. Here's the number that should stop you: 11 years of marriage. 1 court appearance, 12 minutes. Do the math on that. That's less time than it takes to watch this video's introduction. 12 minutes to unwind 11 years, 4 children, and a wedding that once stopped traffic in Manhattan. Let that sink in. When the judge finished, Pat wasn't walked out the front. She was moved through a back door, into a car that was already running, before a single photographer could get the shot. A quiet, engineered exit for a woman whose entire adult life had been staged for cameras. We're taught to remember this marriage as the moment Hollywood and Camelot collided. Sinatra at the reception, Marilyn Monroe at the parties, a Kennedy daughter married to a leading man, everybody smiling, everybody rich, everybody photogenic. Go back to the paper trail instead. The court filings, the wire reports, the biographies written by people who were actually inside that house. A different marriage starts to surface. One built less on romance and more on distance, where she was allowed to live, who she was allowed to see, and how long she was expected to absorb her husband's excess before her own family finally let her walk away. This isn't a love story, it's a timeline, and nothing on this timeline was ever supposed to leave the family. Before we go further, if you want the version of these stories that goes past the press release, subscribe now, because that's the only kind we make here. And if you know somebody who still thinks the Kennedys and Hollywood made the perfect match, send them this one. They're going to want to argue about it by the end. The introduction wasn't romantic. It was strategic. Patricia Kennedy first crossed paths with English actor Peter Lawford through her sister Eunice in the 1940s. Nothing came of it. They ran into each other again in 1949, this time through her brother Jack, already building his political career in Massachusetts. Still nothing serious. They crossed paths a third time in 1953. 3 tries, 4 years apart. That's not a spark. That's a slow, repeated collision between 2 worlds that kept finding reasons to touch. By then, Pat was almost 30. She'd earned her degree at Rosemont College in 1945, directing and acting in student productions, dreaming, genuinely, of becoming a film producer. That door didn't open. Not because she lacked the mind for it, because of the year, and because of what she was. So she took the job that was available to a woman like her, production assistant work in New York, then Los Angeles, then religious radio and film work for a Catholic broadcasting ministry. Competent, disciplined, invisible. Biographers who covered all 5 Kennedy daughters describe Pat, specifically, as the most sophisticated of the group, and also the most introverted. Not the loudest sister, not the one chasing headlines, the one who preferred a quiet dinner and a good film script over a ballroom. That detail matters more than it looks like it should, because it means the marriage that followed didn't just relocate her geographically. It placed a genuinely private woman at the center of the loudest, most exposed social circle in America and asked her to perform comfort in it for the next 11 years. Now here's what almost nobody puts in the highlight reel. Joseph Kennedy Sr., the family patriarch, the man who vetted every marriage that touched his children's names, did not want this one. Lawford was Anglican, not Catholic. He was foreign-born, English by birth. And he worked in an industry old-money Catholics like Joseph Kennedy treated as beneath serious consideration. The patriarch's objections got resolved the way objections in that family usually got resolved. Lawford converted to Catholicism, and in a family famous for prenuptial agreements protecting the fortune at every turn, this marriage got none. No prenup, no financial safeguard. The one time Joseph Kennedy's usual caution disappeared. For the daughter, it would end up costing the most. April 24th, 1954, 12 days before her 30th birthday, Pat and Peter marry at St. Thomas More Roman Catholic Church in New York City. 3,000 spectators gather outside. Not guests, spectators, people who came only to watch a Kennedy marry a movie star. Police lines hold the crowd back. A child breaks through them anyway, just to touch the bride's dress. That number, 3,000, tells you exactly what this wedding actually was. Not a private union, a public merger, East Coast political weight stitched onto West Coast glamour, staged in front of an audience that understood precisely what it was watching. But biographers who studied the marriage found the cracks weren't decades away. They were already there, before the reception ended. The Reverend John J. Kavanaugh performed the ceremony. Every major branch of the Kennedy family stood in those pews, and outside, past the police lines, 3,000 strangers waited for a glimpse of a dress. This was the wedding that told America the Kennedys and Hollywood were now the same family. It's the footage still used today to open documentaries about Camelot. Rarely mentioned in the same breath is what Pat had already spent a decade doing for that family, quietly, with no wedding dress and no camera crew. Through the 1940s and into the 1950s, she and her sisters ran the Kennedy Teas, small, deliberate gatherings in private homes, aimed squarely at persuading undecided women to vote for her brother Jack. They worked. Jack's 1952 Senate opponent, the incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., later blamed part of his loss on those damn tea parties. That's Patricia Kennedy's actual resume before Hollywood ever entered the picture. Not a socialite waiting to be married off, but one of the operatives who helped build the machine that put her brother in the Senate and eventually the White House. Now look at the geography, because the geography carries the whole story. The Kennedy family's actual center of gravity never left the East Coast. Hyannisport every summer, New York every winter, Washington, once Jack won the presidency in 1960. That compound, that dinner table, that machine, that's where the family actually lived. Peter Lawford's career sat 3,000 miles away in Santa Monica. And that's where the marriage physically lived instead. All 4 Lawford children, Christopher in 1955, Sydney in 1956, Victoria in 1958, Robin in 1961, born in Santa Monica, not one of them born anywhere near the compound that defined every other Kennedy childhood. Think about that. Every other Kennedy daughter raised her children within arm's reach of that family's gravity. Pat raised hers, on the opposite coast, fully inside her husband's world instead. And what was that world? Frank Sinatra's inner circle, the Sands in Las Vegas, Cal Neva Lodge, part owned by Sinatra, up at Lake Tahoe, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Judy Garland, close enough to the Lawfords socially that she gave birth to her son in the same hospital on the same day as Pat gave birth to Christopher, and Marilyn Monroe, connected closely enough to the Lawford household that her final phone calls, the night she died in August 1962, reportedly ran through Peter's beach house. That's the environment a convent-educated woman who attended Mass every week of her life was living inside. Not visiting on weekends, living inside, full-time, 3,000 miles from anyone in her family who might have pulled her out. By the early 1960s, something shifts. Pat starts spending more and more of her time in New York. Later, this gets explained as nothing unusual. His career kept him west, her family kept pulling her east. That's the version built for public consumption. Now, here's where it gets strange. Records show Pat had already relocated to a Manhattan apartment with all 4 children more than a year before the word separation ever reached a newspaper. Peter stayed behind, kept the house, kept his California residence. 2 coasts, 2 addresses, a marriage quietly running on a fault line nobody in public was naming yet. When reporters finally caught the scent in spring 1965, Lawford's camp had a script ready. The split, he told Time, was purely geographical. His work was in Hollywood, hers was raising 4 children in Manhattan. Nothing more to it than that. 11 years of marriage, boiled down to a scheduling problem. We're about to show you exactly how thin that cover story really was, and exactly what it was built to hide. Strip away the cover story, and here's what biographers who spent years inside this marriage's paper trail actually found. Not gossip. A documented pattern, corroborated across multiple independent accounts of the Lawford household, through the late 1950s and into the 1960s. Peter Lawford drank, heavily for most of the marriage. Nobody who wrote seriously about him disputes that part, not even the people who liked him. What starts as social drinking, expected and even encouraged inside Sinatra's circle, hardens over the years into something closer to dependency. Alongside it, according to multiple biographical accounts, came a prescription drug habit that deepened as the decade wore on. And alongside that, infidelity. Not a single lapse, a sustained, repeated pattern, traced by biographers through interviews with people who worked inside the Lawford household and moved in the same Hollywood circles. Calneva Lodge deserves a closer look here because it wasn't just a party venue. Sinatra co-owned it, and by the early 1960s it was also documented as a meeting point for figures connected to organized crime, including Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana. Peter Lawford's proximity to that world, as Sinatra's closest Rat Pack ally and the president's own brother-in-law, put him at the exact intersection where Hollywood excess, mob money, and the Kennedy political machine overlapped. That's not a side detail. That's the literal environment Pat's household was embedded in, socially and financially, for most of a decade. Here's the part that matters most. Pat wasn't sheltered from any of it. She wasn't naive. She was Catholic in a way that shaped every decision she made, and her church gave her no clean exit. Divorce wasn't a private choice for a woman raised the way Rose Kennedy raised her daughters. It was a rupture with everything she'd been taught since Roehampton, since Bronxville, since every Sunday Mass of her childhood. So she stayed. Biographers who reconstructed those years describe a woman absorbing her husband's excess for over a decade, while maintaining, in public, an unbroken performance of the glamorous Hollywood wife, smiling at premieres, hosting at Calneva, standing at her brother's side on the campaign trail, never once letting the mask slip in front of a camera. Meanwhile, back on the East Coast, her own family was building the most scrutinized political image in the country. Every Kennedy sibling's marriage functioned as a small piece of that image, whether they wanted it to or not. That put Pat in an almost impossible position. The one sister, whose home life was quietly the most difficult, was also the one under the most pressure to look, on camera, like the family's proof that everything was working. The performance wasn't optional. It was structural. It was expected of her the same way the tea parties had been expected of her a decade earlier. Another job nobody officially assigned her, that she did anyway, because the family needed it done. If a decade of that is hard to picture, hit subscribe now, because what the cameras caught next is about to look nothing like what was actually happening behind it. And if someone in your life still calls this marriage the good one in the family, send them this video. I want to step outside the script format for a second, because something about this research kept bothering me the whole way through. This is a woman who graduated college in an era that wouldn't let her produce film, who took the only job available to someone like her, and who then married into a family that made her famous for being decorative instead. She watched her husband's world, Sinatra, Vegas, Marilyn Monroe's last phone calls, swallow more of her marriage every year, and she couldn't leave because her faith told her leaving wasn't an option available to a Kennedy daughter. When she finally did leave, in January 1966, the papers didn't ask what she'd survived to get there. They asked how fast the divorce went through. 12 minutes. That's the number that made the headline. Not 11 years. 12 minutes. I keep coming back to that gap. November 22nd, 1963. Her brother, the president, is assassinated in Dallas. And something in this marriage's timeline changes almost immediately afterward. Watch the calendar here, because it matters. Jack Kennedy, the brother who first introduced her to Peter Lawford, the brother whose political machine had absorbed her family's energy for over a decade, is gone. And within roughly a year of that funeral, the marriage that had already survived 11 years of documented strain begins its final collapse. That's not a coincidence historians overlook. Multiple accounts of the family describe Jack's death as the moment that removed whatever remaining reason Pat had to hold the arrangement together. The political usefulness of this marriage, Hollywood glamour paired with the Kennedy name, useful for a campaign, useful for a headline, died in Dallas with her brother. What was left afterward was only the marriage itself, and the marriage itself wasn't holding. By spring 1965, word leaks anyway, despite the cover story. Lawford's own lawyer, in Manhattan, ends up announcing what the family had tried to keep contained: an amicable separation. 2 words carrying the weight of 11 collapsing years. That December, Pat travels to Sun Valley, Idaho. Officially, a family ski holiday. Her brother Robert Kennedy is there with his family. Jacqueline Kennedy joins with her 2 children. On paper, nothing but a Kennedy winter trip. But a court filing from just weeks later shows exactly why Sun Valley was chosen. And it had nothing to do with skiing. In 1965, Idaho's residency and divorce statutes moved faster than New York's. When the rest of the family packed up and went home after the holidays, Pat stayed behind. Alone, waiting out the residency clock the law required of her. January 1966. 12 minutes behind a closed courtroom door, out the back exit, into a waiting car. 11 years, compressed into 12 minutes, with an exit planned so carefully that not one photographer caught her face when it ended. That's not a couple who simply grew apart on separate coasts. That's a woman who absorbed a pattern most people wouldn't tolerate for 2 years, holding on for over a decade. Finally given permission by her brother's death and by a fast-track Idaho courtroom to stop. Take one single date. July 1960. The Democratic National Convention, Los Angeles. This is one of the most photographed weeks of Patricia Kennedy Lawford's entire life. She's on the convention floor, standing beside her brother as he accepts the party's nomination for president. Frank Sinatra is there. Tony Curtis is there. Peter Lawford, Hollywood's ambassador to the Kennedy campaign, works the room, connecting studio money and star power to his brother-in-law's candidacy. The photographs from that week became some of the most reproduced images of the entire Kennedy-Hollywood alliance. Pat, smiling, elegant, standing at the exact center of American political glamour. This is the image the family wanted printed. This is the image that got printed, over and over, for decades. Here's what that photograph never shows you. By July 1960, according to biographers who reconstructed the marriage's timeline, the pattern of Peter's drinking and infidelity was already 6 years deep. The convention smile sits directly on top of a marriage that had already absorbed most of a decade of exactly the strain we just walked through. The woman in that photograph had already lived through more of it than any single frame could ever suggest. That's the entire trick of it. The convention photo isn't fake. She really was there, really was smiling, really was doing the political work her family needed from her. But the photograph is also incomplete in a way that matters enormously. It's one frame, pulled from a marriage that, behind that same week's hotel doors, was already running on borrowed time. That's the flip. Not that the public image lied outright, it's that the public image was the only image anyone outside the family was ever allowed to see. The convention got the smile, the apartment got everything else, the drinking, the arguments nobody printed, the slow calculation of exactly how much longer this could be sustained. 5.5 years after that photograph was taken, the marriage it was supposed to represent no longer existed at all. There's a second photograph worth putting beside it. August 1962, Boothbay Harbor, Maine. President Kennedy and Pat, photographed leaving Mass together, relaxed, laughing on the church steps, brother and sister on a summer weekend. It's a warm image. It's also, by biographers' timelines, taken during the same stretch of years when Peter's drinking and infidelity were already well established at home. 2 photographs, 2 years apart, both radiating ease. Neither one hints at what was waiting for her back in Santa Monica. After the courtroom in Idaho, here is what's left of Patricia Kennedy Lawford's life. Sole custody of 4 children, Christopher, 11 years old, Sydney, 9, Victoria, 7, Robin, 4. No remarriage, ever. Her faith didn't offer her that option, and she never went looking for a loophole around it. For the next 40 years, Patricia Kennedy Lawford stayed unmarried. She moved permanently to New York, the city she had already been quietly retreating to for years before the divorce made the separation official. And there, away from the cameras that had followed her wedding, she began rebuilding, not loudly, not for headlines. The rebuilding didn't get long uninterrupted. 2.5 years after the divorce, in June 1968, Pat lost a second brother, Robert Kennedy, assassinated in Los Angeles while campaigning for president. A collapsed marriage in 1966, Jack in 1963, now Bobby in 1968. 3 separate collapses inside roughly 7 years, each one landing before she'd finished absorbing the last. The public narrative treats the Kennedy family's losses as one collective wound. For Pat, they arrived one at a time, in sequence, and she kept working through every single one of them. She founded the National Committee for the Literary Arts. She worked with the National Center on Addiction, confronting, professionally, the exact disease that had helped dissolve her own marriage, and the same disease that would go on to define the final years of her ex-husband's life, and later, painfully, her own son Christopher's public battle with addiction as well. Peter Lawford died in December 1984, 18 years after the divorce, his health broken down by decades of the drinking and drug use biographers had already traced back through their marriage. Pat, meanwhile, spent those same 18 years doing the opposite, building institutions, funding scholarships, working, without fanfare, inside the exact field of addiction recovery that had cost her over a decade of her own life. No dramatic reinvention, no headline comeback tour, just a woman who kept working, quietly, for 40 years after a 12-minute courtroom appearance ended the most photographed marriage in her family's history. She also spent years working directly with the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, helping shape the museum exhibits that would define how the public remembered her brother. There's something almost unbearably precise about that. The woman written out of her own marriage's headline in 12 minutes spent her later decades curating exactly how history would remember someone else's legacy, while her own record sat mostly unread, waiting in newspaper archives for someone to finally go back and check it. Her children carried pieces of that inheritance forward, for better and for worse. Her son, Christopher, would later write openly about his own struggles with drug addiction, the same disease that had already moved through his father's life, and that his mother had spent her post-divorce decades fighting professionally on other families' behalf before it ever became personal again inside her own. September 17, 2006. Patricia Kennedy Lawford dies at her home in New York of complications from pneumonia, 82 years old. Her brother Ted's statement afterward called her irreplaceable. The obituaries that ran the next morning led with the wedding photograph, the church, the crowd, the veil. They almost never led with the 12 minutes. Run the timeline back one more time. A career door closed before it opened. A marriage negotiated more than fallen into, with the family's usual financial caution mysteriously absent. 11 years absorbing addiction and infidelity inside a faith that offered no clean exit. A brother's death that finally, indirectly, freed her to leave. A courtroom appearance timed to 12 minutes. Then 40 years spent building what nobody made her build, for causes traced straight back to the marriage that cost her the most. None of that fits under a photograph of a smiling bride outside St. Thomas More Church. But it's all documented, dated, sitting in the same archives that produced every one of those flattering photographs in the first place. The record was never hidden. It was just never the version anyone chose to print. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the version underneath the photograph, not just the photograph itself, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we go looking for exactly this every single week. And if someone you know still believes this family's marriages were fairy tales from the start, this is the video to send them. She spent 17 years being photographed as a fairy tale. She spent the 40 years after that quietly proving she never needed one.